We are excited always to have Ritch Winter, 35 years as a player agent, joining us on the business of sport. Ritch, how you doing, my man?
I just keep wishing you'd say 23 years.
Well,
Just-
if you want me to lie, Ritch, I can. I went down from 40 because you got
you could
offended by
say
that. So
it's
now it's
more.
35.
You could say it's more than 22 years. I'm doing good.
Sure.
I had a really good
Yeah.
week. A lot of exciting things going on around my clients. It's kind of fun. So good week.
Are you close to contract extensions? Are you
No,
giving
I'm
us a
close to
tease?
dealing with some massive issues that some of them are having, and that's actually more problematic.
Okay.
The deals are easy. Those you do in your sleep. For the
Oh,
most part.
okay. All right. So sorting out some problems. Okay. Nice. Now, the business of sport. We love it because we talk with Richard, obviously the player agent side, but, we talk GM side, we talk trading, we talk a lot. Today, very excited to have Kevin Gilmore on the show, Ritch.
Yeah, Kevin is most recently Belinda Strawnet's right arm in her racing business. Prior to that, he was CEO of the Montreal Impact. Before that, CEO of the Montreal Canadiens, but got his grounding in sport as the first hire Michael Eisner did with the Anaheim Ducks back when he bought the Mighty Ducks and got that franchise. Kevin was in hockey ops for the most part for 25 years as an assistant general manager in Anaheim and in LA, and built a strategy that really became the foundation of 3 Stanley Cup winners, 2 multiple cup winners in the Tampa Bay Lightning and the LA Kings, because the head scout left LA and used the same model in Tampa Bay, which they used pretty effectively. So interesting guy, was taken by Phil Anstrews out of the hockey department because he was deemed to be way too smart to be there. That's not always a challenge, but and he's really built a career on both sides. He's what we refer to as our only 4-sport executive. He's been in horse racing, he's been in soccer, he's been in baseball because he negotiated contracts for a while for the California Angels. So a lot of experience, but a lot of interesting perspectives on hockey because of what he brought in terms of experience to his role in hockey ops.
And he also developed and owns a data set underlying for the model contending team. And Kevin Gilmore joins us now. Kevin, welcome to the business of sports on Sports 1440. How you doing?
Thank you, Jason. Pleasure to be here. I'm doing great. Thanks.
So this research goes from like 1990, it's continued on for you looking at Stanley Cup winners and everything. I guess I always like to go back to kind of how it started. What got you, obviously everybody wants to win, right? So was it just the need to win or to go deeper in hockey that maybe somebody really hadn't gone down that path in depth enough to look? And how has it changed from a 21 team league to a 32 team league?
Well, yeah, I mean, listen, it wasn't about winning. It was about understanding, quite frankly,
Okay.
how to win, right? So I came in and joined the Kings as assistant GM, and having a legal background, I'm very fond of understanding the why behind decisions or how you get to a solution, how you identify a challenge or a goal or a vision and find a way to get there. And I really wasn't getting those answers, right? I was looking at how we how we looked at the draft, how we looked at building a team, and it seemed to me that it was really anchored in the this is how we do things, right? Which is something that's endemic to a lot of sports, a lot of businesses actually.
Yep.
And so the great thing is that Dave Taylor was a GM and he was very open to looking at things differently. And I'm kind of a data geek. I think I was a data geek before those existed.
I actually
and
just
so-
thought he was a geek. I didn't know about the data part after.
So which is why Rich hated me, because I'd throw data at him and he'd be like,
He's a
what?
nightmare.
So I decided to go back and look at really the building blocks for cup winners. And I went back to 1990 to really understand how all these teams were built. And in that span of 12 years, because we put our 5-year plan in place in 2003 after I presented to the team and obviously the board. But went back 12 years and there were a lot of multiple cup winners in there. So not just one and dones, but multiple cup winners, which I think carry greater weight when you look at how to build a contending team.
Yeah.
And really came to the conclusion that it was fairly straightforward, right? You can sit there and say, well, every year the trend changes. For a while it was big mobile defenseman, big physical defenseman. Now small mobile defenseman. Size doesn't matter anymore. Size matters for some. And so what it came down to was that most cup winners, and especially consistent cup winners, were very clear in their approach. They drafted well, they developed well, and they retained their players, right? They built a nucleus of players that had come up through the system. You got to remember Detroit, for instance. I mean, guys, top end players still had to spend a couple years in the minors. That was part of the building, right? And so that's something I noticed. And the other thing I noticed is that there were always there were key positions, right? It wasn't just about having a 23-man roster. It was about having strength in key positions, and especially draft and develop players in those key positions. So top 6 forward, third line center, top 4D starting goalie, which I call the core positions. So you've got 12 core positions on the roster. And when you looked at total draft and develop players and core players on Stanley Cup champions, more than 60% in both categories were draft and develop players in terms of the overall roster players and the core players amongst all cup contenders or cup winners in that time period, right? So
and especially multiple cup winners, right?
multiple cup winners.
Yeah.
So we built this out, and this is actually straight out of the 5-year plan in 2023, where my other frustration, Jason, was that I would look at scouting reports and we'd rate guys from 1 to 7, right? You filled in you gave them a grade for skating, a grade for grit, physical, et cetera, and an overall grade. And I'd ask the question, I said, what's a 6? Because I see a lot of 6s, but what's a 6?
Yes.
Right? And how is that a projection? Okay, he's a 6. So is that how we do it? Just numerical, and we rate them by the average, and you've got a 6.3 and you put them first on your list. So we put the model contending team together, the roster you just showed, with descriptions on players. Right. And in the scouting system, we actually had a drop-down menu that had 2 or 3 examples of existing NHL players that fit that role, right? And we forced the scouts to project players in one of those slots. Okay. Like 1A as a 1A plus, a 1A, or a 1A minus. And we had players in every single one of those categories to help them visualize, okay, does he play like this player, right? Does he play like this player? Because then it gives you a chance, a scout, to sit there and go, he reminds me of, or he looks like he could be this player, which was forcing to think beyond just he's a 6, because 6 is easy, right? He's a 6, he's a 5. You're not really challenging anybody. So we did that, and it really changed the way we looked at the draft and the way we looked at players.
Kevin, when you talk about, you wanted those core guys through draft picks, did you look at, let's say a team would trade, 2 drafted players, younger guys, for an estate, like a Matthias Ekholm trade for Edmonton, right? They traded away a first rounder and they traded away a former for just a recent first rounder. So 2, drafted players to get Matthias Ekholm. So does that then count in the analysis of finding guys homegrown?
Yes. Okay. So if I'll take an example, Philip Forsberg with Nashville, I consider draft and develop because he was acquired before he entered into the system. Right. So, but if you're picking up a player that was a first round pick that spent 3 or 4 years in the minors, I leave them out. I want this to be, you could sit there and say subjectively that, he's part of the organization, but to do this, you have to be really objective. How I rate players, how I rate draft picks, where I categorize players is all about, it's all objective data. You can't sit there and say, well, I think he's a.
Right. Yeah. So you try to, which I'm guessing, in evaluation, one of the hardest things to do is try to remove the emotion from it, right? And just look objectively at it, right? Because all of us, Ritch will watch a player, Kevin, you'll watch a player, I'll watch a player, and you might have him a 6.2, I might have him a 5.8 in different areas. Like, so how are you able to remove that element, or is that virtually impossible to do in analysis?
Well, I don't think I think it was back then. It's not anymore, right? And we can touch on that because as I did this analysis, the first 12 years and also since 34, I didn't just look at cup winners. I looked at every single drafted player. Okay. So I've got data on 8,000 plus drafted players. And for every player, I've rated them, where they fit in the model contending team, whether an NHL regular, 200 games or more, or a core player. So, and couple that with, I could tell you stories on end about discussions leading up to the draft where personal biases for or against certain types of players came into the mix, right? Yeah. And if you look at the statistics, we'll talk about in a second. I mean, you've got a 67% chance of drafting a core player, an NHL player in the first round, right? An NHL player. If you don't, it's because you didn't really look at this objectively. Some subjective elements came into play, right? So
Like you gotta get a guy in the first round.
or I love his grit. I love his grit. He's such a character. And oftentimes they're biases that stem from the scout or the head of amateur scouting or the director of player personnel, or even sometimes the GM's personal experiences as a player, as a coach, as a scout,
Yes.
right?
Mhm.
And so you can't eliminate that. And the eye test is so important. Brian Burke is a big fan of data, but he'll always say you can't replace the eye test. I agree with him. You can't replace the eye test, but can you use AI now today with 35 years of data to understand? Like, I've got every single hit and every single miss, right? We can get into long conversations about what I consider a hit or a miss. But if you don't draft an NHL player in the first round, that's a miss. If
Okay.
you don't draft a core player in the first 15, that's a miss, right? Okay. If you draft a core player anytime after the first round, that's a hit. If you draft an NHL regular after the third round, that's a hit, right? So you look at hits and misses, and if you could do a deep dive with language learning and understand what led to the misses, what led to the hits, you can start identifying those biases within your scouting staff or within your organization, right? You can start identifying through all this data players that other teams may have biases that will lead them to not draft them, right? Find those Braden Points of the world, right, that are too small, right? So I think you'll never replace the eye test, to answer your question, but now with a deep set of data going back 35 years, you could create a model that will allow you to be better at predicting which players will end up being NHL players.
And Kevin, I had this conversation with Barry Trotz over the summer, and he asked his scouts, why did we not select Braden Port or the guy that they drafted? I don't know who he was that never played. And the scout gave him, well, this guy was big and strong. He skated, but then he went through point, hockey sense, this skating, good, defense, good, all of these things. So why didn't we pick him? Well, he's too small. So when you take the objectivity out of it, you leave your scouts on an island where they're going to make a lot of mistakes.
And Rich, it goes beyond that. I've been in conversations where it's like, well, I hear this player is this, right?
Well, did you tell the story of the Getzlaff situation, like that kind of stuff?
No,
that?
I don't want to get into players and stuff, but there's been
It was just a
times
point
we've
where,
passed
yeah, it
on
was just
players where, for reasons that you sit there and you go, well,
really?
yeah, of course we missed them because we let something slip into the conversation and decision making that shouldn't have been a factor.
Yeah,
Right?
Ryan.
Whether it's size or he
Yeah.
can't skate. Like, listen, I'm a good friend of Luke Robitaille. Luke, first training camp, he was told that he had to go back to Hull and learn how to fight because he couldn't skate well enough. All he could do was score goals, right?
Think about that. But Ryan Getzlaff, if I recall from his draft, he dropped in the draft because there were some alleged, character issues, and that clearly proved to be false. Kevin Gilmore joins us here on Sports 1440, the business of sport. Kevin came up with the MCT model. Model contending team is what it stands for. It's lots of research on it. The main basis is the core primary roster positions, top 6 forward, your third line center, top 4 D-men, and a starting goaltender. And when you have a pick in the top 15, if you don't draft one of those guys, that's a miss. And now here, Kevin, the question I have for you about that then that goes in conjunction, because to me, one of the mistakes I see teams is they draft a player and then they screw up his development. They rush him to the league. So how much of that, when you did your model research, looked at says, hey, they drafted a player here, but they didn't do the best to develop. Oh, geez, he's got to play in the NHL. Oh, he's got to play in the American League. And I find still there are teams that are like, well, you got to test yourself at 19 or 20. And I'm like, why? The league is littered with guys who don't get in the league till 24 or 5.
So I've got something I call it a retention rate, right? So for every single player drafted, I'll have number of years in the league and number of years with the club. Right?
Okay.
And it kind of highlights which teams have a higher retention rate and which teams have a lower retention rate. Those are more patient, less patient. But just to bring up something I know is gonna irk Ritch a bit is in going through this data, we had, we changed a lot of things. One of the things I changed was we weren't allowed to draft a goalie in the first round.
Okay.
Right. And when I shared this with Ritch, he's like, wow. And it speaks to your point, right? Teams give up on goalies faster. They take longer to develop for the most part, and they give up on them faster. So, and you look at it in the first round since 1990, you've got 53 goalies that were selected, 50 of them that I've rated, right? Of those, 18 became number 1 goalies. but only 50% of them were still with their team when they became a number one goalie, right? Jason Gregor was on his third team. There's a number of them, right? When you go to the second round, right, because it's not a first round pick, so you tend to be a little more, forgiving and give it more time. But if you get a second round, 88 goalies were drafted, 77% of them I rated. 14 became number one goalies, right? Which 18% is a higher hit rate than players in general in the second round. 12 are still with the clubs that drafted them.
Oh,
right?
So
you go to the third round, once again, 11 number one goalies in historically through 1990 drafted in the third round. 8 of them became number one goalies still with their drafting club. So it speaks to what you're saying, right? We tend to have less patience with goalies, typically less patience with defensemen, I think.
Yep.
I don't know if it's still the case, but so, and what happens is when you do that, you reduce your chances of building that roster that can, listen, so people ask me, why do you think that's the common trait between all teams? You've got that many draft and develop players and core players that are draft and develop. And Ritch will agree with me. We've talked about this. The Stanley Cup, and I'm sure you agree with this, is the hardest trophy to win.
Oh, yeah.
He's got to get through 4 grueling rounds, possibly 7 games. And Ritch has a stat he shared with me that when you get a primary scoring chance, you've got 3/4 of a second to act on it, or else it goes away. So if you've come up through the system with these players, and it's like being in battle, you know the guy to your left, you know the guy to your right, right? And you know where they are on the ice. You know what they're going to do. It becomes instinctive, right?
Yeah.
It's symbiotic. So when you get that puck and you got 3/4 of a second to act on it, you do, right? But if at any point in time in the play that leads up to this, you lose that 3/4 second because the player hesitates because he doesn't know where you are. He's just been brought up. He hasn't played with team. He's traded. He's on his third team, right? You lose those split seconds that make a difference. And in the Stanley Cup playoffs, that becomes critical, right?
Yeah.
Every split second counts. And if you're not in sync, you lose those opportunities. So at least that's my theory from a practical standpoint.
Right.
From a theoretical standpoint, the data speaks to that.
Yeah. Kevin, that's fantastic stuff. We'll take a quick break. We'll come back with more Jason Gregor, Ritch Winter, Kevin Gilmore on the Business of Sports on Sports 1440, Oilers Nation, YouTube, Facebook, and X. We continue on. Sports 1440, Oilers Nation, YouTube, Facebook, and X. And I recommend, if you're listening is great, but if you have a chance, you can watch because, Kevin graciously shared some of the charts and graphs that we're using. So we're putting them up live on the YouTube and Facebook page as we're going through this so you can follow along a little bit clearer. It's great. Really kind of outlines all the research and data he's done since 1990 as Kevin Gilmore joins us. And we're talking about his model that he built, the MCT, which stands for Model Contending Team. And you know what? Ken Holland said it many times. You want to build a team that can take multiple shots at it, Kevin, because you could have the best team, and then all of a sudden in the playoffs, your number one defenseman and your second line right winger go down with an injury, and all of a sudden you're like, damn, like those are 2 real core pieces of our team that just due to injury, which is outside. Now you can try to build depth in your organization, but not many guys can just have everybody slide up a spot and say, okay, this guy's now going to be our number one right defenseman when he's being a really good number 2. Doesn't mean he's number 1. So with that in mind, and you do all this research, looking at the draft, now the NFL is a little different maybe, but maybe the NHL has to get there. Can you tell, so our listeners, we're at the draft now, and I've got the 57th pick, right? And so I trade back down for whatever, a few picks, and this team moves up. Have you done the data to know historically what's a good deal or not when it comes to trading draft picks?
Yeah, and listen, I think you've got it there, right? I've got every single pick since 1990, whether they became an NHL player or core. So from that, I can extract the probability that the 91st pick overall will be an NHL player or a core player, right? And so, there's examples there, but it's not a perfect science. It can be instructive in terms of by trading the 57th and the 113th and 145th pick for the 60th and 69th, right? It can instruct you in terms of what that does to your chances with those 2 higher picks versus the 3 picks you've given up, what your chances are of drafting an NHL player or core player. And all it can do is instruct you, but early on you see that when teams move up a couple of slots, it's because there's a player they really want, right?
Yeah.
But when you get in the later rounds, and the thing is, you look at the later rounds, it kind of flattens out, right? The percentage of the percentage chance of drafting an NHL regular or an NHL core third, fourth round and beyond, it kind of levels off.
Sure.
One could say that a seventh pick is worth the same as a fourth round pick because it's who's doing the best job of finding those players. But at least this can educate someone in terms of, or at least give them information as to whether or not this is something they should do purely from a data and a probability standpoint, right? Then
Yeah.
obviously the subjective aspect comes in the mix. If it's attached to a specific player, then chances are they will disregard the data. But if it's not, why would you do anything but rely on the data to say, yes, this is good for me, or no, it's not good for me? And it can even apply to like when you're trading an NHL regular or core player, right? If you're trading a player for picks, what probability do you have of using that pick or those picks
Yeah.
to ultimately replace that player? And ideally, you want to go above and beyond. Give yourself a chance with 3 picks to get, a core player, an NHL regular for a core player that you're giving up.
And to that, I know your model's about successful teams, but what you just mentioned there, to me, I found is the blueprint for unsuccessful teams. They've got proven NHL players who are good. They give them away for a second round pick who realistically, even if you hit on that pick, it's not helping your team for 5 years. Whereas you might have been better off, negotiating, trying to sign the guy, and you lose them for, and I know people, you're going to lose them for something anyway, but we're seeing lots of guys who are under contract for another year or two getting dealt for multiple picks. And I'm like, God, when you look at the 13, 14% chance of this guy becoming just an NHL player, never mind as good as the guy you're trading, I find that's the vicious cycle of losing. As hard as it is to win, Kevin, it seems sometimes that it's harder to get out of losing.
Well, listen, I think it's to get out of losing, you have to understand what it really takes to win, right? Because you may be doing things that lead to losing, but you're not aware that you're doing it because you haven't really taken the time to understand how to build a winner. And to your point earlier, you can, there's outliers, right? In those 34 years, and we've had a few recently, but to use your example, Colorado was an outlier when they won 3 years ago, right? Landeskog done. They've won 1 playoff round since, right? Because they didn't have enough core players and drafted and developed players to basically fill that gap. Right, or to help bring others up, or guys stepping into a role that have been with the organization. So, but to your point, if you to not do things that lead to losing, you have to understand what it takes to build a winning team, right? And oftentimes, it's how do you build a winning team? Well, this is how we do things. This is how we've always done it, right?
Yes.
They then started bringing in people from outside school. Kevin came from a law firm. People first hired by Michael So he brought a different perspective. We're not seeing that in hockey. We're not seeing the Harvard MBA. A little bit of that's happening in the statistics department or the analytics department, but not a lot. And until that changes, we're going to see an awful lot of teams continue to be bottom run. Teams are just not going to be successful because they don't have any of what Kevin's talking about to be successful. They don't understand the business because they were taught by Toll Blake.
Yeah, that it is. Sometimes, Kevin, I'm getting, because you've been in lots of major sports, right? And so, do all of these sports have that? Like where this is what I know, this is who knows it, and you're slow to move. Or have you seen, like, when you watch it? I know you're still connected to the NHL, and from when you first got into it till now, right? Like, we're seeing other GMs in different markets that come from an analytics background more than ever before. Is it changing in the NHL, or do you still think there's a lot of, well, this is how it's always done and this is how I do it? And you got some players running teams who know hockey from a player's perspective, but not much else.
Yeah, and listen, without being overly critical, I think you're seeing other sports have evolved quicker into using analytics and folks from different backgrounds to bring in kind of an organization and a culture that drives, a roadmap towards winning. I mean, the reason why Ritch touched on this, the reason why Phil Anschutz took me on the business side is not because he thought I was too smart for hockey, is I got passed up on 3 GM jobs because I wasn't a hockey guy.
Right.
Right. And Phil said, listen, Kevin, there's 30 GM jobs. Why don't you come work for me on the business side, transition to the business of sport? There are plenty more jobs in sports that aren't GM jobs, right? And he was right, but if it were up to me, I would have stayed in hockey. If the sport was open at the time, I probably would have found myself having a GM job and being able to implement stuff like this, with an organization beyond just being an assistant GM with a GM that believed in what I was saying.
Right. And when did you get the sense when you were going through that interview process that the guys interviewing you weren't open to what you were saying, or maybe didn't understand it?
So when I put together this 5-year plan, it was basically a 100-page document, and I used that for presentations on GM jobs. And one of them, I was told by the person that was basically heading this up, that the owner had read the entire plan on a flight to Japan, and it's one of the best pieces of strategy pieces he's seen in sports in a long time. But he was a neophyte to the sport of hockey and was advised he should hire a hockey guy. So, when you get that kind of feedback, you go, "What can I do?" I mean, listen.
Right. Yeah. You're pushing a pretty big boulder up of a mountain.
Yeah, exactly. Right? And that boulder, unfortunately, that boulder's still there, I think, in hockey. But now, as data becomes a more important piece of how we watch, consume hockey from a fan standpoint, will that change the dynamic at the management level? I'd like to think so. I'd like to think you have some young people coming up, whether they end up being players and coaches, but they've got that analytics background and the love for data, that they will not just bring the biases they have as a player and their experience as a player or coach, but actually their love of data and analytics into that role.
Asked him, but he certainly doesn't have a hockey background, right? Bright, capable guy. And if you look at Carolina, like, who's doing a better job? They're recycling a fair number of players there, and they continue to just be at the top of the league. Haven't pushed it over yet, but they've been among the best teams in the league because they're taking a new approach.
They are. And I'm very curious about this, Kevin, because when I look at Carolina, the one thing that they've lacked is a true difference maker in the game, right? So when you did your analysis and you looked at, top 6 forwards and obviously top line forwards, there's top line guys. Now, St. Louis won without a Connor McDavid or an Austin Matthews or even a Jack Eichel, for instance, on their top line. Like, they had Tarasenko. He was pretty good, but he's a winger, not a center. I look at Carolina, really good team, lots of really great players, no elite player. In your analysis, does the elite guy, does it change it? Does it open up? Well, maybe you can have 10 because you got this one guy or two, and they're just so much better than other guys that they're going to be able to give you more than Carolina's Sebastian Aho gives you.
Listen, I think that it depends on the makeup of the team, right? You look at Carolina, they've done a good job of retaining the really good draft and develop players. They've got, I think, start of season, they might have had 8 core players that are drafted and developed, right? But you look back historically, like when the Kings built the Cup winners, right? It was early on in Anze Kopitar's career and early on in Dustin Brown's career and Jonathan Quick. So what did they do? They had a good nucleus of core players, but they went out and got Jeff Carter and Mike Richards to basically fill in holes. And it wasn't because those guys were elite, but they complemented and added the offense and the goal scoring and the character and the leadership that they might have felt they were lacking with the younger players, right? So I don't think you can sit there and say you need an elite player to win the Cup, right? I mean, I don't think Vegas had an elite player when they won the Cup, right? You could argue Florida didn't. They had a good group of...
Well, Barkov's pretty close.
Barkov's pretty close, yeah. Obviously Colorado did, you know, but it's not... I don't think that's the... you can sit there and point to one player, or like after Colorado won the Cup, everyone's like, okay, we got to find a Cale Makar.
Yeah.
Right.
Good luck.
But if you do that, if you chase the latest every year, you're putting pieces together, you're grabbing pieces here and there. There's no continuity. There's no consistency. There's no culture within the team, right? The players come in, know what to expect as an organization. LA did that. We did that in LA a long time ago, and it's still there. It's still there. They, granted, they may have slipped off last year when they did the Dubois deal, all right, traded 3 draft and developers for Pierre-Luc Dubois. But But at the core, they remain a team that's focused on drafting well, developing well. Their AHL team is in the same building as they are, the same training facility as they are. So they work together, and that's their focus, and it remains their focus, right? And if they have to go out and grab a piece to fill in a gap, then they can do that. But they're not grabbing a piece every year, right?
And you bring up a fantastic point there. That's become something that's within their organization. So let's say, you talked about, in order to escape being a losing team, you have to understand what it takes to win. And when we look at how often coaches get fired, and sometimes, you know what? Hey, if the coach you hired isn't the right coach, then you should let him go. Now you're just, all you're doing is compounding the issue. But in some cases, I don't care who the coach is. If you don't have enough good players, he ain't winning. Right. That's just like you could bring in Scotty Bowman on the San Jose Sharks. They're not making the playoffs. Right. But the patience factor. So let's say you get a team. Do these new owners have to look and say, okay, we can't be looking for the next new coach or the next UG. We got to have a 5 to 7. And I've actually looked at rebuilds, and I say most of them are 8 years. If you got a proper rebuild, like Chicago tears it down, it's taken 8 years to rebuild all your stuff properly. Do you think there's enough patience with all the money in the game today to do it?
No. Every owner's got a different mindset, right? New owner comes in and wants to win fast, right? And all of a sudden injects a whole bunch of money into making sure that you get the best training center, you got the best this, you got the best that. Our locker rooms are greatest. It's a great recruiting tool, right? But at the end of the day, if the building blocks aren't there, you can do all that. It's not going to change anything, right? So you do have some owners that have been in this for a while, and they, in some cases, have tried to do it the quick route and probably settle down on understanding it takes a while to do this. And the best plan is to basically understand, once again, what it takes to win, put a plan in place and stick to it, right? I mean, Phil Anschutz understood that plan 20 years ago, and he's an owner that stuck to it, right?
Yeah. Kev, in your analysis, because before you started, like from 1990 till now, one of the biggest change in the NHL was the integration of the salary cap. So in part of your analysis, was there ever anything where there's certain amount of allocation of cap, whether it's to your top 4 defense or your top 6 forwards or even one player? Has that become part of the equation that if all of a sudden I got too much in a certain player, it's going to make it much harder to win?
I haven't broken it down that way because I think at the end of the day, here's the way I view it from a cap standpoint. The cap is only a challenge if you do a really good job. If you know what I mean, right? No, seriously.
Yeah,
If you do a really good job of drafting better than everybody else, right? And Ritch has talked about this. 12% of NHL drafted players go on to become core players. Well, if I as a team am improve my scouting and improve my drafting where 20% of the players that I draft are core players, right? Well, I'll have a cap problem at some point, unless I start moving those young assets for something of value, which can come in and help fill the pieces, right? So to me, if you've got cap issues because you've poorly managed it because Ritch has convinced you to spend all your money on 2 of his clients, that's not cap issue. To me, cap issues are if you're a really good team, you will have cap issues. If you do a very good job of drafting, you will have cap issues because you can only fit a certain number of core players on your team and a certain number of NHL regulars on your team. You can't have a 4th line guy being on a 5-year, $3.5 million one-way contract, right? So it's a product of how, in my mind at least, it's a good problem to have if you do a good job of drafting and developing.
Kevin, but the point I think Jason makes to some degree manifests itself in Edmonton because, look, they have 2 of the best players in the world, but good thing. But ultimately, that cost them 2 players to St. Louis because they didn't have any cap space. So ultimately, there's...
actually, Ritch, you could argue that you should have signed Holloway, don't sign Jeff Skinner, and then it's not a problem, right? So like what exactly. Kevin's saying, if you do a good job, then it becomes an issue, but it's a good problem to have because when you have McDavid and Draisaitl, for the next 6 years, you don't need a number 1 or number 2 center. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't draft one because then, Kevin, to your point, you can use that as an asset to fill out a spot you don't have.
Yeah.
Or you could trade Draisaitl, Kevin, to New York at the tail end of his career and get a bunch of assets like Winnipeg just
but in the meantime, you've got to listen, Edmonton's never going to draft in the top 15, right?
Yeah.
But with those first round picks and those second round picks, if you can do a better job and find those players that in 2, 3, 4 years can fit in, while towards the I forget how old Connor and
28
Draisaitl
for
are, but
McDavid.
okay,
20,
so they've
yeah.
got a plenty of years left, right?
Yeah.
So if they can start, identifying young prospects either by drafting them or acquiring them, that can become NHL regulars and, more importantly, NHL core players, they'll have a much deeper core player draft and develop roster, right? I mean,
Yeah.
to come back to Colorado, they thought the same thing, but Landeskog goes away and they're not the same team, right?
Yeah.
God forbid something happened to one of those two in Edmonton, and it's not the same team,
Yes.
right?
But you
And
see
there's no one,
you see an interesting shift in the trade that LA made to Winnipeg. I mean, Winnipeg picked up 3 assets. I don't know where they position as core, but they're good players. They changed the whole mix. They bumped guys from the second to the third, and they created a completely different team with one trade.
Yeah, it really helped them. We'll take a quick break. We'll come back with more with Kevin Gilmore, Ritch Winter, Jason Gregor here, the Business of Sports on Sports 1440, Oilers Nation, YouTube, Facebook, and X. 447. Welcome back, Jason Gregor, Connor Halley, Ritch Winter with us in the Business of Sport. And our guest today, of course, is Kevin Gilmore. He was an assistant GM for the Anaheim Ducks, as mentioned. 3 different times interviewed for GM jobs, but in his words, quote, wasn't a hockey guy, never got it. Then also was the chief operating officer for the Montreal Canadiens, has worked for Major League Baseball, Major League Soccer, thoroughbred racing, and much, much more. And Kevin, I want to get to kind of the bit. We've talked a lot about, building the team concept, but you were also the chief operating officer. So on the business side with Anaheim, and then of course with Montreal, what did you find? What was the biggest challenge on the COO side for you in Montreal?
So one thing, the biggest challenge was the following: is that when I came in, new owners had recently purchased a team for what was then considered an exorbitant price, and the challenge that was issued to me was, you got to grow revenue significantly because 3% growth isn't acceptable. And oh, by the way, we're sold out, right? So that was a challenge. The advantage I had, and this is something that I mention so often that I'm actually going to write a book on it. I'm actually started writing a book on it. But success in sports is driven by the behavior of completely irrational human beings, right?
Yeah.
And it's true, right? If you're a fan, Jason, if I ask you who your favorite NFL team was, there's probably some reason why if you're a diehard fan of a soccer team or a football team, there's probably a reason that goes back to a moment in time years ago where you connected and you've never disconnected, right?
Yep.
And the first time I saw that.
Funny story, Kevin. I was a diehard Dolphins fan because green was my favorite color. And then I finally gave up on them, not because of their success, because I just didn't agree with the moral standing of their owner. I said, I'm out. But you know what? Like, my son cheers for the Chiefs, so I'm like, okay, I'll help. But it's not the same. Like, I'm not a fan. Like, I'm waiting for him to be not the owner of the team anymore, and then I'll cheer for them, which sounds really stupid, but that's the truth.
That's interesting, because I have a theory that at some point you can nudge someone out of their irrationality, right? And the question is, can they come back even though you've nudged them out? So what you're telling me is you were a diehard fan of the Dolphins for a completely irrational reason, i.e. their color, right? The owner's behavior or values caused you to think rationally about the club, and you were nudged out by that. And as soon as you go to the way, you'll jump back in.
Well,
right?
I'm not sure I will, but I think like that. I'm like, I'll try, but it might never be the same. It might never
be the same. So the beauty is, when I got to Montreal, is that that emotional connection was everywhere, right? And I keep saying emotional connections in sports drive irrationality, and there were a whole bunch of irrational people in the province of Quebec and throughout Canada because of the 24 cups, 24 moments that probably their fathers or their grandfathers or their great grandfathers experienced, right? And across Canada, because for the first half of the NHL's existence, Montreal was winning and Toronto wasn't, right? So you gravitate to winners. So that was the advantage I had in Montreal, because it gave me the chance to look at non-conventional, innovative revenue streams that no one had really thought of, and being able to act on it because the target audience was so broad, right? We launched a weekly documentary at the time, 24 CH, which was the first of its kind because we followed the team. We had a show every week. So we were
Yeah.
embedded with the team, 25 episodes a season. No one had ever done that. And part of that was to create more of those emotional connections with fans so that, the housewife who hates her husband because every Saturday they don't go out because he watches the game in the basement. Well, now she's watching the games with him because she watched a show and she saw Brendan Gallagher was such a nice guy with his mother. Right.
Yeah.
But that's what we did in Montreal. Right. And so the transition to the business side, I mean, having spent some time at AEG, I obviously got a great training in terms of operations and business, but coming to Montreal and being able to look at the broad existing and potential fan base and the ability to drive more irrationality is only good for business. And we were able to do that.
So the challenge in Montreal, because you're right, like they're extremely passionate. There's sometimes like, we need a French speaking general manager if we can, or a coach, or bilingual, I should say. And sometimes that's going to limit you on potentially who you can hire. Is it that important still? And I understand it because lots of your fan base are francophone, and so I get you want to connect with them. But if your GM's the best person and he get an assistant GM who's then bilingual. You know what I mean? Is that possible, do you think? Is it real?
Well, it is. I mean, you look at what they did, right? They brought in Jeff Gorton, right?
Yeah.
And as president of hockey operations. And then they brought in a almost bilingual GM, right? To run the team. So they look beyond just the French speaking requirement there. I think fans are fans. If you win, they don't care what language your GM or your coach speaks, quite frankly. Right. The media will make a big stink of it because, as Brian Burke once said, Montreal is the only city where in sports you can be stupid in 2 languages. Right.
Yeah.
And it's true. Right. But the media made such a big thing when Randy Cunneyworth was brought in as interim head coach. The French media just jumped on it. Right.
Yeah.
It's like, how could you do that? And unfortunately, sometimes with that media, from an ownership standpoint or a management standpoint, let media kind of drive your decision making as opposed to factoring that in and seeing if it should in fact drive or even impact your decision making. But I think what you've got now is you've got 2 very capable people. One doesn't speak a word of French, and one is a practicing bilingual.
Now, you also worked as the president and CEO of the Montreal Impact, and you had a real strategy going in. You wanted to build Montreal's international appeal and unique character. How'd you go about it?
Well, listen, the one thing that we did going in was we understood what the challenge was, which is taking a global sport, right, and capitalizing on the global nature of the sport in a city where it had been living in the shadow of the Montreal Canadiens. And our view was, as MLS keeps elevating itself on the international stage, what better way than to position ourselves as, a global brand that speaks to a global French-speaking population of 350 million, right? Could we capture those fans in Europe that are French-speaking that start following Major League Soccer, right? And have them gravitate towards Montreal Impact / CF Montreal, which was the rebrand, to give it more of that international feel. And listen, I think we had the proper piece in place. We brought Thierry Henry over as coach. We brought in Olivier Renard as sporting director, and they got to work on creating kind of a young, because we also changed things from a sporting standpoint, as opposed to just bringing in like highly priced older European players. My view was the Montreal Canadiens and the Montreal Expos weren't built on free agents. They were built on players that were homegrown or at least brought in at a young age and became superstars.
Right.
So let's do the same thing. Now, obviously, COVID threw a wrinkle into that. And then obviously we got a lot of pushback on the rebrand because of that, once again, that irrational emotional connection that people have to their team or their brand. And so it was a tough 3 years, well-intentioned, but I think COVID did a number on us.
When you talk about the irrationality that exists in sports, and I'm sure it's there, obviously in management and coaching, you want to have it way less than in fans, right? Like they joke about fans are fanatic, and it's a fine line for sure. But there's a lot of pressure in those, and you've been in those positions, Kevin, to kind of feel that pressure from your fan base, and maybe it's spurred on by some certain media members in that market potentially at times, but how much of that is real in, like, because people say, well, you know what? I think the minute you start listening to your fans, you're going to be one of them, right? You'll be sitting in the crowd, not upstairs. But how do you balance that? And did you find, whether it's in Anaheim or whether it's in Montreal or, or wherever you've worked, that is a challenge that some teams maybe don't know how to either block out or realize it's there, but not let it impact their decisions?
Listen, I think I have a completely different view. I think you have to embrace that irrationality, because
Right.
the minute fans stop complaining about the latest
care.
trade or the minor league assignment or call up, okay, they don't care anymore, right?
Right.
And at that point, you've nudged them into rationality. So instead of spending $25,000 in after-tax money to get 4 seats in the Reds here at the Bell Center, right? That person says, enough. And the minute they take back that $25,000 in after-tax money and go on 3 spectacular vacations with their family that year, they're never coming back, right? So to me, you have to embrace the irrationality, not let it drive your decision making, but make sure you drive your strategy in terms of how you keep feeding that irrationality, not in terms of making bad moves to get and talk about you, but always having success or a chance for success. Right? Always making sure your fans can connect to the personalities that drive your product, the players, the athletes on the field of play, right? Because that's what people connect to. Making sure you can deliver moments that as a community you can share and experience, right? Whether it's a final run like last year Edmonton did, right? Which brings people together. I remember the scenes outside the arenas. It was spectacular, right? And you've got people there that might have been their first experience.
Yeah.
And they'll cherish that for the rest of, and they're hooked. They're hooked, right? So to me, I think you have to embrace that irrationality and drive it even more.
Kevin, what are you doing now?
So I'm, between the Canadians and the soccer team and Stronach, I opened up my consulting company, and I just went back to doing that after I left Stronach at the end of last year. I'm still working for them on a couple of projects, but listen, this way I get to look at different projects, look at different potential clients. I've got my little office down the street, and I get to pick what I want to do, which is nice, right?
If the NHL came calling, would you be open to returning?
Yeah, listen, I've worked in so many different sports. I'm open to everything, right? As long as it's a compelling, challenging project in sports, I'm ready to go, right? Because that's what I love. That's what I've done for 35 years, and I think I've got a unique outlook on what sport is. And it's funny. I always tell this story about the irrationality. My first realization of that was, obviously he talked about I was really the first hire with the Ducks, and early on, Michael Eisner says, we're calling the team the Mighty Ducks. I'm a 28-year-old, hockey fanatic that's slightly purist. And I echo. Frank Wells says, well, should we really do that, Michael? Should we, is this serious enough? And I said, should we do, a market study, focus groups? He goes, I've got 150 million reasons why that should be the name. And that was the domestic box office and home video take for the movie. And here's when I realized he was right. I was on a flight from LA to Montreal, passing through Toronto. We had just announced the name, and I'm sitting beside this man from Toronto. We start talking. What do you do? Blah, blah. I tell him, he goes, that's my kid's second favorite team. I go, what do you mean? We haven't started playing it. He goes, they don't care. Leafs are their favorite team, but they love the movie. So you know what? And by doing that, he created fandom. I still run into 35-year-olds wearing a Mighty Ducks hat, and I know exactly why they're wearing it, and they're irrational about it, and they still love the team. I would venture that I would be willing to wager that eventually not just the logo, where they went back to the old logo, but eventually they go back to the original name.
They'll go back.
I would not be shocked.
All right, Kevin, this is a fantastic hour, man. I really learned a lot. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much for your time.
It's been an hour already. Wow. I had a great time. I enjoy having these discussions, and it's great to meet you, Jason. Ritch, I'll talk to you tomorrow?
Probably tomorrow, yeah.
Well, you got way more words in today, Kevin, so that's fantastic.
That's new for me.
My commitment on the way in.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Okay.
All right,
see you.
guys. Thank you.
Kevin Gilmore, 35 year. That was fantastic, Rich. Great get. Of course, Rich's connection brings us Kevin Gilmore, of course, with the model contending team. We started about that, the importance of the draft. We're going to revisit that because there's lots of really good nuggets that he talked about, and just, looking at what's a miss. Like, what do we, let's get down to brass tactics. What's a miss? If you have a top 15 pick and it's not a core guy, that's a miss.
It's a huge miss.
That's a miss. And a first round pick who doesn't play, that's a miss.
Right.
It's that simple. Right, you get a second rounder. He doesn't have to be great, but if they hit, that's a hit.
And you got to start measuring in that context. I mean, I think the stuff Kevin will give you to put up on the website, and you may follow up on, will give fans sort of an ability to go, I know what they're selling me, but now they know why it's not right. It's a guy at the dais trying to save his job, throwing out a whole bunch of hooey and hoping it sticks. And the reality is, there's a reason why consistently 16 to 20 to the teams in the NHL don't make a go of it.
Yeah, it's true. Great stuff, Ritch. We'll see you next Wednesday, my man.
I'll be here.